the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Please be seated. So in last week's homily, we were introduced to the crafty figure of Jacob, son of Isaac, son of Abraham. We're probably most familiar with Jacob from the story in Genesis 27 of how he tricked his father Isaac into giving the blessing to him rather than his brother Esau. And thus the future of the covenant passed through Jacob's line and not Esau's. Now, last week's homily focused on another famous story regarding Jacob from Genesis 28, in which Jacob had a dream of a ladder reaching down from heaven. We learned that Isaac drove Jacob into the desert after Jacob's deception and Esau's consequent rage, and that Jacob was at a point in his life where he was probably far from the Lord and hadn't really yet owned his faith for himself. But when Jacob laid down his head to sleep on a rock, in a moment of passivity, he saw a ladder, or better, a staircase, connecting heaven and earth, with angels ascending and descending. Jacob anointed the rock, a place where later he would build an altar, and made a vow to God. Father Tony led us through how Jacob in this passage is a type of Christ, and also a model for the exile that we experience in our own lives in this world, and showed us how, similar to Jacob, we approach the rock of this altar behind me, this point of connection between heaven and earth, every Sunday as we gather for Holy Communion. This morning, then, we arrive at what is surely the most bizarre episode in the life of the patriarch Jacob. And it hasn't escaped my mind that Father Tony chose this Sunday to be away and hand this passage off to me. And it's the account of Jacob wrestling with a man who may actually be an angel, who may in fact somehow be God himself in Genesis 32. Now, it doesn't help that when I think about wrestling, I'm immediately reminded of the time I was in Mexico City for a missions training event and was fortunate enough to attend a lucha libre. So think Nacho Libre. And you have these masked wrestlers, or luchadores, who are engaged in this outrageous choreographed fighting, drove everyone wild. It was a great time, even if my rudimentary Spanish wasn't near good enough to make sense of all the insults, profanities the luchadores were hurling at one another. Felt like I was stepping in piles of beer all the time on the ground. Okay, so I don't think that's the kind of wrestling match we're supposed to envision here in Genesis 32. And I think it's safe to venture that there was a lot more riding on this wrestling match than at any Mexican lucha libre. And indeed, as we'll see, while the literal sense provides us with an account of a crucial, life-altering event in the life of the patriarch Jacob, we'll see that the spiritual sense allows us to explore how our present lives, characterized as they are by a sense of wrestling or striving with God, will in the next life give way to the beatific vision, to seeing God face to face. So let's begin with the literal sense, where any spiritual sense must be anchored. And the literal sense teaches us about the story God told in history. Now, to summarize the Jacob narrative after his dream at Bethel in Genesis 28, Jacob continues on his journey out of the Promised Land, into exile and away from his brother Esau, out to the refuge of his uncle Laban. And over the next chapters, which encompass some 20 years, Jacob marries Laban's daughters, Leah and Rachel, prospering with respect to both children and livestock. But his default resort to trickery leads him to having to flee from Laban back to the Promised Land. And so by the time we pick up the story in Genesis 32, Jacob is on the brink of what he assumes will be an unhappy reunion with his brother Esau, like one of the worst family reunions ever, who is coming to meet Jacob with some 400 armed men. Jacob, hoping to avoid Esau's wrathful retribution, dispatches his servants to Esau with presents, hoping that he will appease his brother. But on the eve of his meeting with Esau, where our Old Testament lesson for this morning picks up the story, Jacob sends away his wives and his children so that he is left alone. And then the text tells us, a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. Okay, some questions. Who is this man? Why are they wrestling in the middle of the night? The biblical text does not say, simply introducing this unusual occurrence without any kind of preamble. In any event, we read in verse 25 that this wrestling match lasted all through the night. And when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. But Jacob still clings to this man, who says to Jacob, "Let me go, for the day has broken." And so we are left with still more questions. What kind of special wrestling moves does this mysterious man have that he can dislocate Jacob's hip with a single touch? Is he a vampire that needs to hide before the coming of the sun? Is he a ninja? A luchador? Again, much to our frustration, the text does not answer these questions, at least not at this stage of the narrative. So returning to the story, Jacob refuses to let the man go until he gives Jacob a blessing, to which the man responds by changing Jacob's name to Israel, which likely means he strives with God. For as the man tells Jacob, "You have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Jacob fails to learn this mysterious man's name, but he does succeed in getting a blessing from him. And we are still confused about all of this until verse 30 provides the key clarification. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." In this mysterious midnight wrestling match, Jacob has somehow seen God face to face. So what are we to make of this? Clearly, something more is going on here than meets the eye. But what? We are undoubtedly supposed to connect this text back to last week's text. 20 years earlier, God had encountered Jacob alone at night in a dream at Bethel as he left the promised land. Now, 20 years later, as he re-enters the land, Jacob meets with God alone at night at Peniel. At the narrative level, Jacob's encounter with God at Peniel is far more transformative than that at Bethel. Immediately prior to the wrestling match at Peniel, we see Jacob confess his weakness, his unworthiness, and his need for God. As a result of this encounter at Peniel, Jacob is given a new name, a new blessing, and a new testimony to God's faithfulness, empowering Jacob's reconciliation with Esau in the next chapter. At the beginning of this scene, Jacob sees God as an adversary. After his decades in exile, with a confrontation with his brother Esau looming on the horizon, Jacob must have wondered if God's promises announced to him at Bethel would ever come true. And yet, as the wrestling match proceeds towards daybreak, Jacob, despite it all, clings to God. In having somehow glimpsed the face of God, Jacob is blessed. In the moment of his physical brokenness, knowing that the arrival of daybreak would mean his death, for a man cannot truly see God and live, Jacob perseveres, and he prevails. His new identity, his transformation from trickster and deceiver to prevailer and overcomer, is sealed with the change of his name. And the permanent reminder of this encounter with God is permanently written into his flesh through the injury to his hip. The sun sets at the beginning of the scene on a fugitive, on an exile. And the sun rises at the end of this scene on a man reborn, resurrected, ready at last to enter into the promised land. So clearly, this incident has massive implications for the character of Jacob in this portion of Genesis. But what could this passage tell us about Christ, about our lives, about our destiny? So as we know, traditionally, the church has not stopped with the literal sense, but has proceeded on to the spiritual sense. After all, the Bible tells us that all the scriptures speak of Christ and the spiritual realities that he brings. So let's take a look at how this passage speaks of Christ in the typological sense. The scene of Jacob wrestling with God throughout the night should call to mind Jesus wrestling with the Father in prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane throughout the night of his arrest, a wrestling that continues to play out over the course of his passion. Jacob receives a bodily wound over the course of his wrestling, as does Christ on the cross. Like Jacob, Jesus prevails in brokenness. Both Jacob's and Jesus' wrestling with God results in vindication and blessing, which includes a change of name. As Philippians 2:9 tells us, Jesus' obedience to the point of death on a cross resulted in God the Father highly exalting him, bestowing on him the name that is above every name. And just as Jacob's wrestling with God was immediately followed by his reconciliation with his brother Esau, so too, after his resurrection, Jesus reconciled with his disciples who had abandoned him during his crucifixion. We could go on with further examples of typological links between Jacob and Jesus, but this should be sufficient to make clear the point that we began to explore last week, that Jacob is a type of Christ. Small wonder, then, that Jacob's 12 sons would become the foundation of the nation of Israel, the people of the covenant, just as Jesus' 12 disciples would lay the foundation of the church, God's new covenant people. So building off this typological or allegorical sense, we can next identify the moral sense of the passage, which tells us how we should live. Let's return to the issue of Jacob's new name, Israel. While modern scholars suggest the primary meaning in view in the name Israel is he strives with God, the church fathers, following Philo, the Jew, emphasized a different aspect of the word's roots, taking Israel to mean seeing God. Again, following Philo, the church fathers saw in this story a representation of our own spiritual struggles with God, a struggle that continues until God grants us the gift of contemplation, such that we too can be said to see God, of which I'll say more later. Typical then are the words of Ambrose, the 4th century bishop of Milan and mentor to Augustine. Therefore Jacob, who had purified his heart of all pretense and was manifesting a peaceable disposition, first cast off all that was his, then remained behind alone and wrestled with God. For whoever forsakes worldly things comes nearer to the image and likeness of God. What is it to wrestle with God, other than to enter upon the struggle for virtue, to contend with one who is stronger, and to become a better imitator of God than the others are? Let's unpack Ambrose's words in a bit more detail. Surely, Ambrose points out, Jacob's wrestling with God was preceded by the beginnings of a spiritual transformation that God was already working in Jacob's heart. Jacob in Genesis 32, verses 9 to 12, comes before God earnestly in prayer, confessing his unworthiness and his desperate need for God's deliverance. For this, Ambrose says, he purified his heart of all pretense. And Jacob in verses 13 to 21 sends gifts to Esau in hopes of pacifying him. This is what Ambrose means by manifesting a peaceable disposition. But Ambrose really centers his analysis on the next element of the story. Jacob in verses 22 to 23 divests himself of all his worldly goods. As Ambrose comments, for whoever forsakes worldly things comes nearer to the image and likeness of God. Now this morning for our canticle, we sang the Beatitudes, very timely. As Ambrose helps us to see, Jacob in this passage is an example of one who is pure of heart, a peacemaker, poor. And what does Jesus promise such people in the Beatitudes? That they will see God. We find then three things to emulate in Jacob. Three things, virtues to aspire to along the lines of the Beatitudes that may well prepare our hearts to encounter God. Humility, peacefulness, and a lack of attachment to earthly things. To be clear, of course, it is possible that God can and does sometimes reveal himself to people in the midst of their misery and their sin, at the full extent of their depravity, farthest from him. But here Ambrose gives us what I would call the normative way in which we hear from God. Ambrose shows us that we, like Jacob, are probably most open to hearing from God when we humble ourselves before him, when we pursue peace in our relationships, and when we cease our striving for the things of this world. Indeed, the entire ascetic tradition of the church is predicated on this understanding of our need to step back from earthly things, for our ears, indeed our eyes, to be open to what God has for us. Now, sometimes I like to think that had I been born in the Middle Ages, my interests in education, theology, academic scholarship would have almost certainly meant that I would have been a monk of some variety, unless I would have met Carissa earlier, I suppose. It's easy to romanticize such a life in which we assume it would be easy to devote oneself to prayer and contemplation. But I'm sure those monks of old had many of the same struggles that we do today. And sometimes I think that if only I had less work commitments, fewer family responsibilities, more financial security, surely then I would have the time, the peace, and the purity of heart to hear more clearly from God. But even if that were true, that is not what my life currently is, nor do I expect it's yours. And so I, like you, probably need to struggle forward with God, even amidst all of my busyness, anxiety, sin, and uncertainty. This life is indeed a struggle for virtue, a wrestling match with a God whose ways we often do not understand, and whose plans don't seem to align with our own desires or expectations of God. As John Calvin comments, the story of Jacob teaches us that all the servants of God in this world are wrestlers, because the Lord exercises them with various kinds of conflicts. Like Jacob, we wonder if God's promises to us will ever come true. We wonder if God really means to bless us when we suffer another miscarriage, face another setback in our marriage, spend yet another week unemployed, get passed over for a promotion, fail to see progress in our struggle with a particular sin, receive an unexpected major medical bill, or feel excluded by others. And so sometimes it can feel like all we can do is keep wrestling to God, to cling to this God who may, despite our prayers to the contrary, in fact be leading us towards disappointment, towards danger and uncertainty, towards the cross. Jacob had to pass through the refiner's fire before he could inherit God's promises. We should expect nothing different in each of our lives, for it is through the suffering and trials of this life, through the wounds inscribed in our very flesh, that this God leads us to true and lasting blessing, and ultimately to behold him face to face. This brings us then to the anagogical sense, which tells us about our destiny. While God in his mercy may deign to give us glimpses of himself in this life, we know that one day our struggles will finally cease, and we will behold our God face to face. As St. Augustine writes concerning this passage, the vision of God will be the reward of all the saints at the end of the world. We will never be worthy no matter how humble, peaceful, or detached from earthly things we may be, for the incredible gift of what the tradition calls the beatific vision. As St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13:12, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known." What if modern American Christianity is so anemic, and it is, precisely because it has lost sight, no pun intended, of our ultimate end, or telos? Ask the average churchgoer what is their final purpose in life. They may speak of being a good person, of going to heaven when they die and being reunited with loved ones, and perhaps even of finally having all of their questions answered. How many of us, though, would answer in line with the great tradition, that we might see God face to face? As St. Anselm prayed, "I was created to see thee, and not yet have I done that for which I was made." Our life's purpose, in other words, ultimately is to see God. As contemporary Anglican theologian Hans Boersma writes, we can interpret life as a pilgrimage to a sacred place and treat history as an apprenticeship that aims at acquiring a skill. The sacred place is the face of God, and the skill, the beatific vision. The Genesis account of Jacob wrestling with God concludes with Jacob saying, "I have seen God face to face." And though precisely in what sense this was true for Jacob is impossible to say, what we can say for sure is that our ultimate end, beyond all of our sin and struggle and pain and uncertainty, will be to have in full what Jacob had only in part, the beatific vision. One day we will cry out like Dante at the conclusion of his pilgrimage, "O plenitude of grace, by which I could presume to fix my eyes upon eternal light until my sight was spent on it." Dante beholds God, and in so doing sees all of time and history bound together in the mind of God, himself being transformed by the love that moves the sun and other stars, and the longing of his soul is satisfied. That mankind is offered such an incredible destiny should leave us asking, as in the words of the morning psalm, "O Lord, what is man that you regard him, or the Son of Man that you think of him?" Here we arrive at mysteries that go far beyond the scope of this sermon. But Dante and the psalmist help us begin to cultivate an imagination for our eternal destiny through the lens of the beatific vision. Church, let us be the kinds of men and women who, whatever we may be going through, never cease to wrestle with and cling to the God whom we will one day see face to face. Amen.